Before a nation existed, there was a boy. Before there was a conflict that divides the world to this day, there was a woman alone in the desert, with a child in her arms and no visible way out. The Bible records the origin of the Arab people with a precision that most have never stopped to read, and what is written there changes everything you think you know about these people. His name was Ishmael, and the story the biblical text tells about him is far more complex, far more human, and far more surprising than the simplified version that circulates in sermons, textbooks, and political debates. Ishmael is not a footnote in the narrative of Abraham. He is a central character in one of the most emotionally charged episodes in the entire Old Testament. A man whom an angel spoke of even before he was born. A son who was cast out of his home with a canteen of water and no certainty of survival. And the ancestral father of one of the largest and most diverse civilizations the world has ever known. To understand Ishmael, you must first understand the world into which he was born. And that world begins with a woman named Hagar. Hagar was not a minor character. Scholars have debated her exact origin for centuries, but the biblical text in Genesis 16 describes her as an Egyptian, a servant of Sarai, the wife of Abraham. Some ancient interpreters, including Jewish commentators from the rabbinic period, suggested that Hagar might have been one of the women given to Abraham during his time in Egypt, when the Pharaoh gifted the patriarch with servants, gold, silver, and livestock. If this tradition has merit, Hagar was Egyptian by birth, but had lived for years in the household of a man from Ur-dos Chaldeus who had crossed the Fertile Crescent, following a voice only he could hear. She knew the world of tents, the rhythm of migrations, the logic of clans. But she was a foreigner in all of it. Sarai had a problem that the ancient world considered catastrophic. She could not have children, and we're not talking about months of waiting or disappointments accumulated over a few years. We are talking about decades. The text of Genesis 11 already records that Sarai was sterile, that she had no children, long before Abraham received his call in Ur. When God renews the covenant with Abraham in Genesis 15 and promises that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars, Abraham was already 85 years old. Sarai was 75. The biological window was, in human terms, completely closed for decades. It was at this point of maximum tension between divine promise and human impossibility that Sarai made a decision. A decision the biblical text records without explicit judgment, but whose consequences occupy entire chapters. She went to Abraham and said, "See that the Lord has kept me from having children. Go then, have relations with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her." It is Genesis 16, verse 2. Place this scene in the perspective of the surrounding world. The practice of a sterile wife offering her servant as a concubine so the family could have heirs was not Sarai's invention. It was a documented custom in the ancient Near East. Clay tablets found in Nutsi, an Assyrian city, and in Babylonian legal records from the period show marriage contracts that provided for exactly this situation. If a wife was sterile, the servant could bear a child who would be legally considered the wife's child. The child was born upon the knees of the wife in a ritual of immediate adoption. Sarai was not improvising. She was resorting to the only social mechanism available to solve the problem of succession. Abraham accepted, and Hagar conceived. What happens next is one of the most psychologically charged episodes in the book of Genesis. When Hagar realizes she is pregnant, the text says she began to look at her mistress with contempt. The Hebrew word used here, kalal, carries the sense of diminishing, of treating as of lesser value. Hagar, who was a servant, suddenly carried Abraham's heir, and that changed something in her. Perhaps it was the first time in her life she felt power. Perhaps it was the instinct of a mother protecting the child growing inside her. The text does not explain the motivation, it only records the result. The relationship between the two women collapsed. Sarai went to Abraham with a direct complaint. "May my wrong be upon you. I myself placed my servant in your arms, and now that she sees she has conceived, I am despised by her. May the Lord judge between me and you." It is Genesis 16, verse 5. Abraham responded with a diplomacy that today would sound like abandonment. "Your servant is in your hands. Do to her what seems good to you." And Sarai afflicted her. Hagar fled, a pregnant woman alone walking through the desert toward Egitto. The path she chose followed the road to Sur, the same route that connected Canaan to Egitto through the Sinai region. She was going home, or trying to get there. What she found along the way was not in her plans. Beside a spring of water in the desert, a being the text calls the angel of the Lord found her. And what this angel said to a fugitive slave in the middle of the desert is one of the most extraordinary scenes in the entire Old Testament. It was not a judgment, it was not a correction, it was a revelation. "Hagar, servant of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going?" It is Genesis 16, verse 8. She answered honestly, "I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai." The angel said two things that changed everything. First, return to your mistress and submit to her. Second, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they cannot be counted. Then came the prophecy. You are pregnant and will give birth to a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your affliction. It is Genesis 16, verses 11 and 12. Analyze what just happened. An Egyptian slave, without a family name, without social status, without any power, fleeing alone in the desert, received an angelic visit with a promise of countless descendants. This type of promise, in biblical vocabulary, was reserved for patriarchs, for Abraham, for Jacob, for Moises, not for fugitive servants. The biblical text, at this point, is doing something radical by the standards of antiquity. It is placing a woman of the lowest condition at the center of a first-order divine narrative. The name the angel commanded her to give the son carries all this weight. Ishmael, in Hebrew Ishmael, means God heard. Not God blessed, not God chose, God heard. The affliction of a slave was recorded, processed, and answered. And the son's name would be the permanent reminder of that. Every time someone called that boy by name, they would be repeating a theological declaration. The voice of someone who had no voice reached God. But the prophecy about Ishmael did not stop there. The angel continued, "He will be like a wild donkey among men. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will dwell in front of all his brothers." It is Genesis 16, verse 12. This phrase has been interpreted in radically different ways over the centuries. Some have read it as a curse, others as a description of fierce independence. The image of the wild donkey, per Adam in Hebrew, was not necessarily negative in the context of the ancient Near East. The wild ass was an animal feared and admired for its freedom, its endurance in the desert, and its refusal to be tamed. It was the symbol of one who bowed to no one. The prophecy described a people who would live on their own terms, in their own space, without submission to external empires, and he would dwell in front of all his brothers, face to face, not behind them. Hagar returned. The text says she submitted, and she gave birth to the son. Abraham was 86 years old when Ishmael was born. Genesis 16, verse 16. It is the only chronological data the text offers at this moment. And it matters because it marks the beginning of a 14-year period in which Ishmael was Abraham's only son. 14 years as the heir. 14 years being raised for a purpose. 14 years learning what it meant to be the son of a man who spoke with God. Then came the day of circumcision. Genesis 17 records a renewal of the covenant between God and Abraham. this time with a name change. Abrau became Abrau. Sarai became Sarah. And along with this covenant came circumcision as a permanent physical sign of the agreement. Every man in Abrau's house would be circumcised. Everyone. The text is explicit. Abrau was 99 years old when he was circumcised, and Ishmael his son was 13 years old when he was circumcised. It is Genesis 17 verses 24 and 25. 13 years. This detail, seemingly technical, remained etched in cultural memory with extraordinary precision. Circumcision at 13, instead of the 8 days prescribed for the descendants of Isaac, became the ritual mark of distinction between the two lineages. For the Jewish people, circumcision on the 8th day. For the Arabs and for Islam, circumcision often performed during adolescence, two traditions that diverge in timing but trace back to the same father, the same covenant, the same act of faith recorded in the same chapter of the same book. In this same chapter 17, God reveals to Abrau something that will change the family dynamic irreversibly. Sarah, at 90 years of age, will conceive and have a son, and the name of this son will be Isaac. The text records Abrau's reaction with disconcerting frankness. He fell on his face and laughed. It is Genesis 17, verse 17. Then he said to God, "If only Ishmael might live before you." The phrase is dense. If only Ishmael might live before you. It is the plea of a father who heard that his eldest son was about to be displaced by an unborn brother. It is a man trying to negotiate with God for the permanence of the son he raised for 14 years. God's response to Abrau at this point is one of the most balanced in the entire text. God does not ignore Ishmael. He does not discard him. "Yes, as for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him, make him fruitful, and multiply him exceedingly. He will father 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation." It is Genesis 17, verse 20. The same vocabulary of Abrau's blessing, multiply, fruitful, great nation, was applied to Ishmael. The biblical text is not diminishing Ishmael. It is tracing for him a parallel destiny, different but not lesser. Sarah had Isaac, and the text that follows in Genesis 21 is one of the most unsettling in the entire book. Isaac grew up. He was weaned. Abraham held a great feast on the day his son was weaned, likely when the child was between 2 and 3 years old. And Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abrau, mocking. It is Genesis 21, verse 9. The word translated as mocking, metzahek in Hebrew, comes from the same root as the name Isaac, which means he laughs. Ishmael was laughing, playing, doing what children do, but Sarah read that as a threat. What Sarah did next revealed the depth of the conflict that had settled in that house. She went to Abrau and said, "Cast out this slave woman and her son, for the son of this slave shall not be heir, along with my son, with Isaac." It is Genesis 21, verse 10. The text says, this command was very distressing in Abrau's eyes because of his son. The Hebrew word ra, distressing, carries the sense of something that causes pain, suffering, anguish. Abrau did not want to send Ishmael away. Ishmael was his son. He was between 15 and 16 years old at this point. He was the son who had grown up in his tent, who had learned from him, who had been circumcised alongside him. And now Sarah demanded that he leave. God's response to Abrau in that morning of anguish was not a full explanation. It was an instruction and a promise. Do not be distressed because of the lad and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her voice, for in Isaac your descendants shall be named. Of the son of the slave woman I will also make a nation, because he is your descendant. It is Genesis 21, verses 12 and 13. Early in the morning, Abrau rose, took bread and a skin of water, placed them on Hagar's shoulders, gave her the boy, and sent her away. She went and wandered in the desert of Beersheba. Consider what is happening in this scene. Abraham, who had negotiated with God for the survival of Sodom, who had interceded for nations and kings, sends away his own son with a loaf of bread and a skin of water. There is no record that he said anything to Ishmael before he left. There is no documented hug. There is no promise made directly to the son, only the early morning, the bread, the skin, and the departure. The water ran out. The text records with cutting precision what happened next. When the water in the skin was gone, Hagar cast the boy under one of the bushes and went and sat down opposite him, about a bowshot away, for she said, "I will not watch the boy die." And she sat opposite him and lifted up her voice and wept. It is Genesis 21 verses 15 and 16, a bowshot away. The Bible measures the separation between a mother and a son about to die in units of combat. She could not bear to watch, so she moved far enough away so as not to see. And there, at that calculated distance, she wept. The boy also wept. The text says that God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, "What troubles you, Hagar? Do not fear, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Arise, lift up the boy and hold him by the hand, for I will make him a great nation." It is Genesis 21 verses 17 and 18. Then God opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a well of water. Scholars debate whether the well was already there, and Hagar simply could not see it because of her despair, or if the well was created at that moment as a miracle. The Hebrew text uses the verb to open in relation to Hagar's eyes, not in relation to the ground. What is at stake is not necessarily the supernatural origin of the well, but the sudden ability to see what was there. Despair blinds, fear narrows the field of vision, and in a moment when a mother was sitting a bowshot away from her dying son, intervention was needed so she could see the water just a few steps away. She went, filled the skin with water, and gave the boy a drink. Ishmael survived. And the biblical text makes a point of recording what happened next with a care that contradicts any reading of definitive abandonment. God was with the boy, and he grew and dwelt in the desert and became an archer. He dwelt in the desert of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. It is Genesis 21, verse 21. God was with the boy. This small phrase carries enormous weight. It is the same expression the text uses to describe the divine presence with Josue, with Samuel, with Davi. It is not providential abandonment, it is active accompaniment. Ishmael grew up in the desert of Paran, a region geographers identify with the Sinai Peninsula and the areas north of the Arabian Peninsula. He became an archer, a specialist with the bow. Hagar went to Egito, her homeland, and from there brought a wife for her son. Ishmael's identity was being formed at the crossroads between the Semitic desert and Egyptian civilization, between the world of his father and the world of his mother. While Ishmael grew up in the desert of Paran, becoming an archer, the world around him was in full transformation. The second millennium before the Common Era was the period of consolidation for the great empires of the Near East. The Egitto of Ramses II extended into Canaan. The Hittites dominated Anatolia. Mesopotamia was living through the Middle Assyrian period, and in the midst of these power collisions, the nomadic tribes of the Syrian and Arabian deserts occupied a unique position. They were free. They paid no tribute to any pharaoh because the desert was ungovernable for armies that depended on supply routes. They built no walls because their walls were the dunes. They guarded no cities because their city moved with them. They were what the prophecy called a people whose hands were against everyone and everyone's hands against them, and who would dwell in front of all their brothers. Not dominated, not domesticated, present. Ishmael's expertise with the bow was not just a survival skill, it was an identity. The bow in the ancient world was not only a weapon, it was a symbol of autonomy, of the ability to feed oneself without depending on any fixed agricultural system, of defending territory without needing stone walls. The archer was the warrior of the open space, the one who could strike from afar and disappear before the enemy arrived. It is the perfect description of the Arab tribes who for centuries would be feared and respected by the empires that tried to control them, almost always without success. The biblical text, through Genesis 25, provides a list that many readers pass over without due attention. The sons of Ishmael by their names according to their generations, 12 princes according to their nations, 12 sons, 12 princes. The number has immediate resonance in the biblical narrative because Isaac would also have a son, Jacob, who would also have 12 sons, who would become the 12 tribes of Israel. The dodecaphonic structure, 12 branches from the same family trunk, appears in both of Abraham's lineages. It is not a narrative coincidence. It is deliberate mirroring. The names of Ishmael's 12 sons are Nebaiote, Kedar, Adbeel, Mibsam, Mizma, Dumah, Massa, Hadade, Temah, Jetur, Naphis, and Kedemah. Each of these names corresponds to a people or region that scholars can identify with varying degrees of certainty in the historical and archaeological records of the ancient Near East. Nebaiote is mentioned in Assyrian sources from the 7th century before the Common Era as a nomadic people of the regions north of Arabia. Scholars associate the Nebaiote with the Nabateans, those extraordinary people who carved Petra into the rose-colored rock of Jordania and built one of the most sophisticated commercial empires of the ancient world. Kedar appears repeatedly in biblical prophecies as a representative name for the Arab peoples in general. Isaiah 42 mentions the villages of Kedar. Isaiah 60 mentions the flocks of Kedar. Jeremiah 2 and 49 brings Kedar as a name for desert tribes. Ezekiel 27 describes the merchants of Kedar. In Hebrew prophetic vocabulary, Kedar became synonymous with Arab, just as Edom was synonymous with Esau and Israel was synonymous with Jacob. Dumar is identified with the oasis of Dumat al-Jandal in northern Arabia Saudita, a strategic point on the caravan routes connecting Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean. Tema appears in Babylonian cuneiform inscriptions from the period of Nabonido, the last king of Babylonia, who spent 10 years in the city of Tema, possibly modern-day Taima in Arabia Saudita. Jetur and Naphis are mentioned in the books of Numeros and Chronicus as peoples with whom the Israelite tribes of Reuben, Gad, and the half-tribe of Manasseh came into conflict east of the Jordan River. The geographic map formed by the 12 names covers an arc that goes from Syria in the north, passes through the Negev desert, descends through the Sinai Peninsula, traverses northwestern Arabia, and extends into the heart of the Arabian Peninsula. Think of the extent of this territory. We are talking about a region that today comprises parts of Jordania, Israel, Arabia Saudita, Syria, and Iraq, a continental expanse. And the biblical text says exactly where these 12 peoples dwelt. And they dwelt from Havilah to Sur, which is before Egitto in the direction of Assur. He settled in front of all his brothers. It is Genesis 25, verse 18, in front of all his brothers. The same expression from the angel's original prophecy. What was said about the boy before he was born was fulfilled in the territorial map of his descendants. Ishmael lived 137 years. Genesis 25. Verse 17, it is a longevity worthy of a patriarch. The text says, he was gathered to his people, the same expression used for the death of Abraham, Isaac, and Moises. A language that, in Old Testament narrative standards, is reserved for figures of significance. Ishmael did not die as an outcast. He died as an elder with a counted posterity, documented territory, and a name etched in sacred genealogies. But before Ishmael died, the biblical text records a moment that no geopolitical analysis of the Arab-Israeli conflict usually mentions. When Abraham died at 175 years old, the text of Genesis 25 verses 8 and 9 says the following, "And he gave up the spirit and died in a good old age, full of years, and was gathered to his people. And his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron." Isaac and Ishmael, the two sons together, the only moment in the entire biblical narrative where the two appear in the same place, performing the same action. It was not a political meeting, it was not a treaty, it was a burial. Two brothers separated by decades, reunited by the only reason that makes all human separation seem small in the face of finitude. They buried their father together, and after that, the text separates them again forever. This scene is a detail that tradition often obscures, but which the text itself preserved with care. The sacred writer could have simply said that Abraham was buried, without specifying who did it. The choice to name the two sons side by side is deliberate. It is as if the text wanted you to know that those two men, despite everything, shared this moment. That for a brief instant, beside their father's tomb, the distance between them measured zero. Ishmael grew up in the desert of Paran, with an identity constructed in the gaps between two worlds. On his father's side, he was the son of a man who came from Urdos Chaldeus, who had walked hundreds of miles following a divine call, who had negotiated with kings and with God, who had pitched tents from Mesopotamia to the Negev. On his mother's side, he was the son of an Egyptian woman who knew the Nilo, the markets of Memphis, the language of scribes, and the rhythm of a civilization that had lasted for millennia. Ishmael was neither Chaldean nor Egyptian. He was the first of a new kind, a desert dweller with memories of two civilizations and loyalty to no palace. This tension of identity, belonging to two worlds without being completely absorbed by either, would become one of the cultural hallmarks of the Arab peoples throughout all documented history. The fact that Hagar sought a wife for Ishmael in Egitto, her homeland, has implications that go beyond the merely familial. It means Ishmael was raised with two languages, two sets of cultural references, two systems of understanding the world. The lineage born of this union between the Semitic and the Egyptian produced peoples who would be, over millennia, the primary cultural and commercial intermediaries between Africa and Asia. The Arabs, throughout history, were absorbers and transmitters of civilization to a degree rarely equaled. Greek mathematical heritage reached medieval Europe through Arab scholars. Aristotle's philosophy was preserved and commented on in Arabic before being retranslated into Latin. Paper, the astrolabe, algorithms, algebra, astronomy, and medieval medicine are unthinkable without the contribution of the peoples who trace back, in the realm of ancestral memory, to the son of Abraham, expelled to the desert of Beersheba. The connection between Ishmael and the Arab peoples is not just a Christian or Jewish theological inference. It is an identification that the Arabs themselves have made over centuries. Classical Arab genealogies, recorded by historians like Ibn al-Kalbi and Ibn Hisham in the medieval Islamic period, trace the Arab lineage back to Ishmael with details that overlap surprisingly well with the biblical list of the 12 sons. The so-called Adnanite Arabs, the lineage of the northern Arabian Peninsula, trace their ancestry to Adnan, whose line goes back to Ishmael through Nebaiote or Quetta, according to different traditions. The Canaanite Arabs from the south of the peninsula have a distinct genealogy that historians identify with the Semitic peoples of ancient Yemen, but the pan-Arab narrative that emerged in the Islamic period embraced Ishmael as the symbolic father of all Arabhood. The Kaaba of Mecca, The holiest sanctuary of Isla is described in Islamic tradition as having been built or rebuilt by Abraham and Ishmael together. The Al-Qur'an in Baqarah 2:127 describes Abraham and Ishmael raising the foundations of the sanctuary and praying together. This narrative, preserved in a religious tradition that arose more than 2,000 years after Genesis was written, anchors its sacred identity in the same character the biblical text presents as the son cast out of his home with a canteen of water. The son who almost died of thirst in the desert of Beersheba became, in the memory of more than 1 billion people, the builder of the most visited sacred house on earth. The number is impressive. It is estimated that more than 1,800,000,000 Muslims in the world describe Ishmael as a spiritual or genealogical ancestor. This represents more than 22% of all humanity alive today. Add to that the 180 million to 250 million Arab Christians in the Middle East and the diaspora, who also recognize their Ishmaelite ancestry, and the more than 400 million Arabs of cultural and ethnic identity who inhabit the region from Morocco to the Persian Gulf. The numbers are difficult to pinpoint with exact precision, but the scale is undeniable. A population equivalent to about a quarter of humanity traces its identity back to a boy who survived because his mother opened her eyes and saw a well in the desert. The Bible, in its section known as the Old Testament, mentions the descendants of Ishmael dozens of times throughout the prophetic books. Isaiah 21 describes the fall of Ishmaelite peoples before the Assyrian and Babylonian empires with the same prophetic language used for Israel and Judah. Ezekiel 25 and 27 describe the Arabs of Kedar as merchants who traded with Tyre. Jeremiah 49 prophecies about Kedar and the kingdoms of Hazor with the same intensity as the prophecies about Edom and Moab. The descendants of Ishmael are not background characters in the pages of the Old Testament. They are actors with a documented role in the geopolitics of the ancient Near East. Archaeological records corroborate this presence. Assyrian inscriptions from the 8th and 7th centuries before the Common Era mention Ishmaelite tribes by name, including the Kedarens, as peoples who paid tribute to kings like Tiglath-Pileser III, Sargon II, and Assurbanipal. The Nabateans, whose capital Petra is today one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world, left an impressive material civilization. Their water channels carved into the rock, their monumental tombs, their system for collecting rain in the desert, their writing, which became the direct ancestor of the modern Arabic alphabet. All this was built by a people whose biblical ancestry traces back to Nebaiote, the firstborn of Ishmael. The Nabatean alphabet, derived from Aramaic, evolved over centuries until it became the Arabic that is written today, from Arabia Saudita to Morocco. This trace of graphic continuity was not invented by theologians. It is what paleography, the scientific study of ancient writing systems, demonstrates through the analysis of letter forms. The people whose letters generated modern written Arabic descend from Nabateans, whose biblical ancestor was the son of Ishmael. The line is not just genealogical, it is cultural, linguistic, and graphic. The desert of Paran, where the biblical text says Ishmael grew up, has been identified by biblical geographers as the region covering the Sinai and northwestern Arabia. This region was, over millennia, the corridor of passage between Mesopotamia and Egypto. The caravan routes that crossed this desert transported spices, incense, metals, textiles, and slaves between the greatest empires of antiquity. The Arab peoples who inhabited and controlled these routes had economic power disproportionate to their military size. They were indispensable intermediaries in a world that depended on long-distance trade to function. When the caravan that took Jose to Egitto passed by his brother's house in Dothan, the text of Genesis 37 says they were Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, carrying spices, balm, and myrrh to Egitto, Ishmaelites. The same text that narrates the sale of Jose identifies his buyers as descendants of the half-brother who had been expelled from Abraham's house decades earlier. Two sons of Abraham, separated by Sarah's decision, crossing paths on the road without knowing they were being woven into the same providential tapestry. But the question the text poses without answering directly goes beyond the historical dimension. What does it mean to be heard by God without being chosen for the primary role? What does it mean to be blessed with nationhood and multiplication while the formal covenant passes through another lineage? Ishmael received blessing without receiving the promise of the covenant. He received posterity without receiving the land of Canaan. He received the name that means God heard without receiving the title of covenant bearer. This distinction, which theologians have debated for centuries in terms of election, grace, and purpose, is presented by the biblical text without a clear value judgment. The text does not say Ishmael was less loved. It does not say his lineage was less important. It says the paths were different, and this difference has fueled one of the deepest divisions in human history, a division that today is expressed in borders, in conflicts, in declarations of war, and in peace treaties that the whole world follows without fully understanding where it came from. The Bible does not present Ishmael as a mistake. It does not present him as a negative consequence of a misguided human decision. It presents a man about whom God spoke before he was even born, whose name was chosen by an angel, whose survival was guaranteed by direct intervention, and whose descendants were counted as a legitimate nation. What tradition did with this story, from whichever side it comes, is another conversation. But the original text is more complex, more human, and more surprising than the simplified version most people know. Ishmael is not the villain of this story. He is one of the most tragic and fascinating characters in the entire Old Testament. A son who did not choose to be born the way he was, a teenager who did not choose to be expelled, a man who built a life in the desert that his father did not know and that his mother had left behind. And the peoples who came from him carry, to this day, the mark of an origin that was much more than a historical accident. When Hagar opened her eyes in the desert and saw the well, she filled the skin and gave water to her son. A simple gesture, a motherly gesture, a gesture that, according to the biblical text, was sustained by the presence of a God who heard the cry of a boy on a sand dune. This boy survived. He grew. He had 12 sons who had 12 nations that formed peoples who today number hundreds of millions of people living from Morocco to Pakistan, from Moscow to Cairo, from São Paulo to Dearborn in Michigan. The story of Ishmael did not end in the desert of Beersheba. It is still being written in every Arabic tongue spoken, in every minaret built, in every child born into an Arab family who carries, without knowing it, the name of a God who heard a slave woman crying alone on a dune in the middle of nowhere 4,000 years ago.